It started as a routine stop on a stormy industrial highway. A well-dressed black man, a veteran officer who thought she'd seen it all. No shouting, no chase, just assumptions moving faster than facts. What turned this ordinary moment into a crack that exposed an entire system wasn't violence. It was the truth refusing to stay quiet. Officer Rachel Monroe had been wearing the badge for 17 years, long enough for the fabric of the job to work its way under her skin, long enough that she no longer thought of instincts as guesses. To her, instincts were evidence you hadn't written down yet. She sat higher in the seat than most officers did, shoulders squared, eyes forward. The patrol car felt like an extension of her body. The radio chatter faded into background noise. She wasn't listening for words anymore. She was listening for patterns. Monroe believed in patterns. She believed certain streets meant certain problems. Certain hours meant certain behavior. Certain cars didn't belong in certain places. She didn't call it prejudice. She called it experience. That word had carried her through internal reviews, civilian complaints, and quiet warnings from supervisors who never wrote anything down. Experience had taught her this city survived on unspoken rules. You learned them, or you got swallowed by them. That night, the highway cut through a stretch of industrial warehouses and closed factories. No foot traffic, no nightlife. Just wet asphalt and the low hum of distant machinery. It was the kind of place Monroe trusted her instincts more than dispatch. Then she saw the sedan. Black, polished, expensive enough that the rain slid off it like it didn't want to stick around. It moved too smoothly for the area, too deliberately. Monroe noticed the rims before she noticed the driver. She always did. Her jaw tightened just slightly. "That's interesting," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. Behind the wheel sat Marcus Reed. He didn't look nervous. His hands were steady, resting where they could be seen. He wore a tailored coat, collar turned up against the rain. The interior light revealed calm, controlled movements. No rushing, no fidgeting. To Monroe, that calm didn't read as confidence. It read as calculation. A car like that didn't end up here by accident. That was the story her mind supplied without effort. She didn't question it. She never had. The story had been reinforced too many times over the years, told in roll call briefings, whispered between shifts, confirmed, selectively, by the arrests that made it to court and the ones that didn't. Marcus Reed didn't know any of this, of course. He didn't know he had already been placed into a narrative before the lights came on. He only saw the reflection of red and blue ripple across his windshield. He slowed, signaled, pulled to the shoulder exactly the way the handbook said you should. Monroe watched every movement. She didn't see a man heading home. She saw an anomaly, a disruption in the order she believed kept things from falling apart. In her world, order came from categorization, from putting people where they belonged, and Marcus Reed didn't belong here. She stepped out of the cruiser with the confidence of someone who expected compliance. The rain darkened her uniform, but she didn't seem to notice. Her boots hit the pavement with purpose. She adjusted her grip on the flashlight, thumb resting near the switch, muscle memory taking over. Inside the cruiser, Evan Carter sat quietly, watching. Fresh academy polish still clung to him. He'd learned the rules as they were written. Monroe operated by the rules as they were lived. Carter noticed the details Monroe didn't think twice about. The way Reed's window came down before being told. The way his voice stayed level. The way he asked permission before reaching for anything. "Evening, officer," Reed said. His tone wasn't submissive. It wasn't defiant either. It was neutral, professional. Monroe didn't like that. Neutrality disrupted the script. It left no obvious opening. She preferred fear or bluster. Those were easier to manage. Neutrality forced you to think. She asked the questions she always asked. Where are you headed? Why are you here? Her voice was firm, clipped, efficient. Reed answered without hesitation. Each response fed neatly into the story she'd already decided was true. A successful black man in the wrong place didn't challenge her worldview. It confirmed it. This is how systems work when no one stops to ask why. Each piece fits because everyone expects it to. Dispatch runs plates, officers conduct stops. Supervisors review reports written in language that sounds objective enough to pass scrutiny. No one sees malice. They see routine. Monroe didn't wake up that morning intending to ruin a life. She woke up intending to do her job. That distinction mattered to her. It was how she slept at night. But intent doesn't erase impact, and repetition turns assumptions into reflex. Marcus Reed felt the weight of those reflexes pressing in long before anything crossed a legal line. He'd felt it before in other cities, other stops. The slight tightening of a jaw, the pause before a response, the questions that weren't really questions. He knew this dance. He also knew how dangerous it could become if he made the wrong move at the wrong moment. So he stayed still, spoke clearly, followed instructions to the letter. And still, the tension grew. Because this wasn't about what he was doing. It was about what Monroe believed he represented. A story she'd heard too many times to question. A pattern she trusted more than the person standing in front of her. Around them, the system hummed along, unaware. The camera on Monroe's shoulder blinked steadily. Dispatch logged the stop. Evan Carter watched, uneasy but silent. No alarms went off. No one intervened. This was the familiar order of things, a machine running smoothly, each part doing exactly what it was designed to do. And that was the problem. Because prejudice doesn't need anger to survive. It doesn't need shouting or slurs or obvious hate. It only needs repetition. The same assumptions applied again and again until they feel like facts. That night wasn't extraordinary. That's what made it dangerous. Nothing had gone wrong yet. Nothing illegal had happened yet. But the path was already set. Every step followed the last, guided by a belief that had never been tested. And as the rain continued to fall, washing nothing away, the system moved forward, confident, unquestioned, and blind to the damage it was about to cause. The moment didn't explode. It crept. Monroe's voice shifted first, not louder, sharper. The questions changed shape. They stopped being about clarification and started sounding like tests, each one narrower than the last. Each answer from Marcus Reed met with a pause that lingered a beat too long. She asked him to step out of the vehicle. Reed complied immediately. He moved slowly, deliberately, hands visible, body angled away, the way he'd learned to do over years of careful survival. The rain darkened his coat as his shoes hit the pavement. He stood where she indicated, feet apart, posture neutral. Inside the cruiser, Evan Carter felt his chest tighten. This was the point in the stop where things usually went one of two ways. Either the officer relaxed, satisfied, or the tension tipped into something harder to control. Carter had seen both in training videos. He'd never seen it this close in real life. Monroe circled Reed once, flashlight beam sweeping, not searching for a weapon, searching for confirmation. "You seem real comfortable," she said. Reed nodded once. "I'm just following instructions." The words were polite, measured, and somehow that made Monroe's jaw set. She asked him to place his hands on the hood. Then she corrected herself. On the roof. Then she adjusted again. "Spread your fingers. Don't move." Each instruction chipped away at the space between procedure and power. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to assert control. Carter stepped out of the cruiser, rain soaking into his uniform. He stood a few feet back, eyes flicking between Monroe and Reed. His hand hovered near his radio, then dropped. He told himself Monroe knew what she was doing. She always did. That was the lie rookies learned early. Trust experience. Don't second-guess your partner. Don't create friction on a dark road. Still, Carter noticed Reed's breathing. Slow, controlled. The kind of calm that came from effort, not ease. He noticed how Reed adjusted his stance when Monroe moved closer, instinctively creating space without being told. This wasn't resistance. It was awareness. Monroe leaned in slightly, close enough to invade personal space, close enough that Reed could smell the faint trace of coffee on her breath. She asked him again where he was coming from. The same answer as before, clear, consistent. Her flashlight paused at his wrist, then his collar, then his face. "Anything in the car I should know about?" she asked. Reed shook his head. "No, ma'am." Carter opened his mouth, closed it. He'd been taught that if something felt wrong, you spoke up early, not after. Early. He'd recited that line in the academy, sitting in a climate-controlled classroom with laminated manuals and hypothetical scenarios. This wasn't hypothetical. But Monroe wasn't doing anything illegal. Not yet. She was stretching discretion, not breaking rules. And Carter knew how those moments were remembered later. The ones who spoke up were labeled difficult, disloyal, not ready. He stayed silent. Monroe's radio crackled. Dispatch asked for a status update. She answered without turning away from Reed. "Routine traffic stop. Stand by." Routine. That word carried weight. It turned tension into paperwork. It told everyone listening that nothing unusual was happening. Carter shifted his feet. Water pooled around his boots. He glanced at Reed, then away. He told himself the stop would end soon, that Monroe would satisfy whatever instinct she was chasing and send the man on his way. Instead, she asked Reed to turn around. He did. She instructed him to place his hands behind his back, not cuffed, just positioned, for now. Carter's stomach dropped. This was the line. The quiet one. The one no one talked about afterward because it didn't leave bruises. The moment where authority stopped being about safety and started being about dominance. Reed's shoulders tensed just slightly. His hands met behind him, fingers interlacing. He didn't protest. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Monroe noticed the tension anyway. "Relax," she said. Reed exhaled slowly. Carter watched his partner's posture change. The confidence hardened. The patience thinned. Each movement grew more deliberate, more assertive. She had committed now. Backing down would feel like losing. He could hear his own heartbeat over the rain. "Say something," a voice in his head urged, but another voice answered faster. "Don't make this worse." That was the lie silence told itself, that staying quiet kept things from escalating, that neutrality was harmless. Carter looked at Monroe's shoulder. The recorder blinked steadily. Everything was being captured. That should have made him feel better. It didn't, because cameras didn't intervene. People did. Reed stood there, restrained by nothing but compliance and calculation. He knew the risk of any sudden movement. He knew how easily a narrative could shift with one wrong breath. Monroe took a step closer. Too close. Carter felt his throat tighten. He adjusted his stance, cleared his throat. "Rachel," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. The moment passed, small, almost invisible, and that was all it took. Silence isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just fills the space where resistance should be. Monroe continued. Carter stood by. Reed waited. No one shouted. No one reached for a weapon. No one crossed a line obvious enough to force intervention. But control slipped anyway, inch by inch. Later, people would ask why Carter didn't step in, why he didn't say more, why he didn't stop it before it went further. They would say he wasn't the one who did it, and they'd be right. But standing next to harm while it unfolds doesn't make you innocent. It just makes you present. That night, on a rain-slicked highway, the most important decision wasn't made with force or fury. It was made in the quiet space between knowing something was wrong and choosing not to act. And that choice changed everything that followed. It happened fast, and then it didn't. Monroe's hand moved before anyone said a word. A sharp pull at Reed's arm, not enough to throw him off balance, just enough to remind him who was in control. His shoulder turned slightly. His foot slid on wet asphalt. He corrected himself immediately. "Don't move," Monroe said. "I'm not moving," Reed replied. The answer came too quickly, too calmly. That was the problem. Monroe interpreted stillness as defiance, calm as calculation. In her mind, cooperation was supposed to look smaller than this, quieter, apologetic. She stepped in closer and tightened her grip. Her radio crackled again. Dispatch asked if everything was under control. "Affirmative," Monroe said. "Subject is being uncooperative." The word landed heavy. It changed the story in real time. Evan Carter flinched. He knew what uncooperative meant on paper. It meant discretion widened. It meant force became justifiable if things went sideways. He looked at Reed's hands, still behind his back, fingers interlaced. No sudden movements. This wasn't resistance. Monroe pushed him forward, guiding him toward the hood. Reed's chest made contact with the metal, harder than necessary. His breath left him in a sharp exhale. "Hands flat," she ordered. They were already flat. She adjusted them anyway. Spread them wider. Pressed down. Reed's face turned slightly to the side, cheek against cold steel. Rain ran down his temple and dripped off his jaw. Carter's mouth went dry. This was no longer a stop. It was a demonstration. Monroe reached for her restraints, not cuffs yet. She paused, scanning Reed's body again. The hesitation wasn't caution. It was calculation. She was deciding how far to take it. Reed spoke again. "Officer, am I being detained or arrested?" The question was procedural, textbook, calm. Monroe stiffened. "Don't tell me how to do my job." She twisted his arm upward, just enough to draw a sharp intake of breath. Not a scream, not a plea. Just pain acknowledged and swallowed. The shoulder-mounted recorder caught everything. The angle, the sound, the shift in Monroe's tone. The exact second when force stopped being preventative and started being punitive. Carter's radio buzzed softly at his hip. Another unit checking in. He didn't answer. He told himself Monroe would stop, that she was asserting control before releasing it, that this was a momentary escalation. Instead, she escalated again. Reed's knee buckled as she pushed him down onto the hood harder. His weight shifted. His foot slipped fully this time. He caught himself, but not before his shoulder struck metal with a dull sound. "Stop resisting," Monroe said. "I'm not resisting," Reed said through clenched teeth. The words overlapped. The recorder captured both. Later, people would listen to that moment over and over. They would argue about tone, about timing, about who sounded more credible. In the moment, none of that mattered. Monroe reached for medical gloves, not to check on him, to search him. Procedure said a frisk required clear articulation, specific concern, observable threat. None of that was present. She proceeded anyway. Her hand moved quickly, roughly, patting down Reed's sides, his back, his pockets. She lingered longer than necessary. Each movement carried intent, not discovery. Reed winced as pressure landed on a sore spot near his ribs. His breathing changed, shorter, tighter. Carter noticed. He stepped closer. Just a step. Monroe shot him a look, a warning. He stopped. Dispatch spoke again. "Do you require medical assistance?" There was a pause. 2 seconds. Long enough to matter. "No," Monroe replied. "Subject is fine." Reed said nothing. His silence wasn't consent. It was strategy. He understood what asking for help could trigger. He understood how easily pain could be reframed as aggression. Monroe finally snapped the cuffs on. Too tight. The ratchet clicked twice more than necessary. Reed's shoulders jerked slightly at the pressure. "Check the fit," Carter said quietly. Monroe ignored him. She guided Reed toward the cruiser, not walking him, steering him. Reed's head dipped as he entered the back seat, careful not to hit the frame. The door slammed shut. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Inside the cruiser, Reed shifted carefully, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate his shoulder. The cuffs cut into his wrists. His breath came shallow now. He leaned forward slightly. "I'm having trouble breathing," he said. Monroe stood outside the vehicle, rain streaking down her face. She looked at him through the glass, her reflection layered over his. "You're fine," she said. She turned away. The recorder kept blinking. Carter stood frozen. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his belt. He looked at the cruiser door, then at Monroe, then at the road behind them, empty and dark. This was the moment where the system could have corrected itself. A pause, a check, a supervisor call, a simple question asked out loud. None of that happened. Monroe returned to the driver's seat. She logged the stop, wrote the narrative as she drove. Uncooperative subject, safety concerns, lawful use of force. Each word locked the previous action in place. Reed's breathing grew more labored. His head tipped back against the plastic divider. His eyes closed briefly. Carter watched him in the rearview mirror. He swallowed hard. "Rachel," he said again, louder this time. "What?" she snapped. "He said he can't breathe." Monroe exhaled sharply through her nose. "He can breathe enough to talk." That settled it, in her mind, in the log, in the chain of decisions that followed. The dispatcher heard everything, the tone, the exchange, the words chosen carefully to sound routine. No override came. The car pulled away from the roadside, tires hissing against wet pavement. The highway swallowed the scene like it had never existed. But it had, and every decision leading up to that moment had been recorded. Not as an accident, not as a misunderstanding, as a sequence. A system doesn't break when someone throws a punch. It breaks when small warnings go unanswered, when silence is mistaken for professionalism, when procedure becomes cover instead of protection. That night, the violence wasn't sudden. It was assembled, step by step. And the camera never blinked. The truth didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived quietly, the way it always does, after the damage is already done. At the precinct, the processing room hummed with fluorescent light and stale air. Monroe filled out her report without looking up. Her handwriting was steady, confident. Each line followed the last like muscle memory. Uncooperative subject, safety concerns, lawful escalation. Evan Carter stood a few feet away, reading the screen over her shoulder without really seeing. Reed sat on the bench, wrists cuffed, shoulders slumped forward just enough to ease the pressure. A medic glanced at him once, asked if he was conscious, then moved on. No one asked why his breathing was still uneven. No one asked why the cuffs were still tight. The system was doing what it always did after moments like this, closing ranks, reducing friction, turning an incident into a file. Monroe finished typing and hit submit. The click sounded final. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 3 hours later, in a quiet office 2 states away, a different screen flickered to life. A secure inbox. A new upload. Time-stamped footage from a shoulder-mounted recorder flagged automatically for review. The analyst who opened it didn't know Monroe, didn't know Carter, didn't know Reed. He only knew patterns. The rain, the stop, the language shift, the moment when the word uncooperative appeared without cause, the failure to call for medical clearance, the dispatcher's hesitation. By morning, the file had a name, Marcus Reed. And that name meant something. Not to Monroe, not to Carter, to the people who had been watching this precinct for months. Reed wasn't a police commander. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't outrank anyone in that building. That was the mistake everyone made when the truth finally surfaced. He was something quieter, more dangerous. An independent advisor to a federal oversight committee, brought in off the books. No announcement, no badge, no protection detail. His job wasn't to command. It was to observe. To drive through the same streets as everyone else, to get stopped like everyone else, to see how the system behaved when it thought no one important was watching. Precinct 14 wasn't the first stop on his list. It was the last. By design. Reed had reviewed complaints, patterns, use of force reports that stopped just short of discipline, stops that ended in nothing but paperwork, officers who always seemed to escalate, but never crossed a line obvious enough to trigger alarms. Until now. The footage ran again, and again. Slower this time. No single moment screamed misconduct. That was the point. It was a chain, a series of small decisions that leaned in the same direction, each one defensible on its own, together, impossible to ignore. Back at the precinct, Monroe laughed with another officer as she poured stale coffee into a chipped mug. She didn't know yet. She felt untouchable. She always had. Carter avoided her eyes. Reed sat alone in the holding room, head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed. He flexed his fingers carefully, testing sensation. His wrist throbbed. His shoulder burned. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that truth doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to survive intact. By noon, the call came in. Not from a supervisor, not from internal affairs. From the city's legal liaison, requesting all footage, all logs, all dispatch audio from the previous night. Monroe's smile faded. She asked why. The answer was vague. Routine review. External inquiry. That was when the room shifted. Officers exchanged looks. Carter felt his stomach drop. Monroe's fingers tightened around her mug. She set it down carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter something invisible. In a conference room upstairs, Reed's cuffs were finally removed. A senior administrator entered, posture stiff, voice suddenly respectful. "Mr. Reed," he said, We'd like to speak with you. Monroe heard the name through the glass. She frowned. The sound didn't match the image she had built in her head the night before. She watched as Reed stood, slowly, carefully. The administrator opened the door for him. No one touched him this time. The realization didn't hit like thunder. It crept in, quiet and nauseating. This wasn't about rank, or power, or some hidden badge that made the story neat and satisfying. This was worse, because if Reed hadn't been who he was, nothing would have happened. No review, no inquiry, no sudden concern about procedure or breathing or tight cuffs. Just another report, another file, another night erased by routine. That was the real twist. Not that the man they hurt mattered to the system. It was that he only mattered because the system didn't know he was watching. Reed didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten lawsuits. He didn't demand heads roll. He asked one question. Is this how it usually goes? No one answered, because everyone in that room knew the truth. Yes. And that was the problem. The man they had dismissed wasn't random. He wasn't unlucky. He wasn't an exception. He was the test. And the system had failed it the way it always did, by assuming no one important was on the other end of the baton. If Reed had been anyone else, the night would have ended quietly. That question hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. And for the first time, Precinct 14 wasn't being asked to explain one officer. It was being asked to explain itself. The story stopped being local the moment the footage left the building. It didn't explode right away. There was no headline that night, no alert buzzing phones at 3 a.m. The truth moved the way it always does when it's real. Quiet, relentless. Impossible to pull back once it's in motion. By morning, the video had been duplicated, logged, and secured in 3 separate systems. 1 internal, 1 civilian, 1 federal. Redundancy wasn't an accident. It was policy, written after years of watching evidence disappear when it became inconvenient. By noon, a clipped version reached a journalist who had learned how to read police reports the way some people read weather patterns. He didn't publish it immediately. He watched it twice, then a third time without sound. That was enough. The story broke online before it ever reached television. A short clip, no commentary, no captions, just raw footage and a timestamp. The rain, the words. The moment uncooperative appeared without cause, people recognized it instantly. Not the officers, the pattern. By the end of the day, the video had been shared tens of thousands of times. Comment sections filled with the same sentence, rewritten over and over by different hands. I've seen this before. Inside Precinct 14, the mood shifted. Conversations stopped when supervisors walked by. Doors closed more often. Phones rang longer before anyone picked up. Monroe was called in for a preliminary interview. Not an interrogation, not yet. Just questions. Calm voices, neutral faces. She answered confidently, repeated her report verbatim. Her tone never wavered. But for the first time, the room didn't nod along. Across town, Reed sat in a plain conference room, sleeves rolled up, shoulder wrapped loosely in a brace. He watched a different screen now, live coverage of a press briefing he hadn't asked for and didn't attend. A city official stood at a podium, clearing his throat too often. Words like review, concern, and transparency were stacked carefully, like sandbags against a rising tide. Behind the podium, a seal caught the light. Federal. That was when it became clear this wasn't about one stop, or one officer, or even one precinct. Within 48 hours, an external task force was announced, not to investigate Monroe alone, but to examine patterns of conduct across Precinct 14. Use of force incidents, medical response times, dispatch protocols, supervisor oversight. Everything that had once been handled quietly, internally, was now subject to daylight. Officers were instructed not to discuss the case. Some complied. Others couldn't stop talking. Stories surfaced, half-remembered nights, stops that felt wrong but never crossed a line clear enough to report. Carter was interviewed on the third day. He sat stiff-backed, hands folded, answering questions he wished someone had asked earlier. His voice dropped when he described the moment Reed said he couldn't breathe. He didn't say how it felt. He didn't need to. The pause said enough. Outside the department, the conversation changed too. This wasn't framed as a rogue officer's story. It couldn't be. The footage was too clean, the escalation too methodical. Commentators stopped asking, "Why did she do it?" They started asking, "Why was this allowed to happen at all?" That question was harder to deflect. Records were pulled, compared, matched. A line appeared where none had been officially drawn before. Officers who escalated quickly, supervisors who signed off, dispatchers who deferred. No single decision looked catastrophic. Together, they told a different story. Monroe watched the hearings from home after being placed on administrative leave. She sat in the same chair for hours, remote, untouched, eyes fixed on the screen as strangers dissected her actions, frame by frame. They weren't angry. They were precise. That was worse. Reed testified briefly, not about pain, not about fear, about sequence, about timing, about what happens when no one interrupts momentum. He spoke the way he always did, calm, measured, uninterested in drama. "I wasn't there to provoke anything," he said. "I was there to see what would happen." The room went quiet, because everyone understood what that meant. This wasn't a story where justice arrived because the right person was hurt. It arrived because the truth landed in the exact moment the system could no longer ignore it. A working camera, a documented pattern, a public already tired of explanations that went nowhere. That intersection, truth, timing, and visibility, was what forced change. Not outrage, not protest. Exposure. By the end of the month, Precinct 14 was no longer being defended. It was being examined. Policies rewritten, training suspended, leadership reshuffled. The system hadn't been attacked. It had been seen. And once seen, it had no choice but to respond. Because power built on silence can survive anger. It cannot survive evidence that arrives at the wrong time for the right people. That was the real shift. The moment the story stopped being about one night in the rain and became about how many nights like it had passed without anyone watching. Monroe lost her badge on a Tuesday morning. No cameras, no crowd, no speech about service or sacrifice. A supervisor slid an envelope across the desk, eyes fixed on the paperwork, not her face. Inside were the things that had defined her adult life: credentials, access cards, the weight she used to feel at her hip. She didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. By Friday, her name was gone from the roster. By the end of the month, the pension she'd counted on was reduced to a number that barely covered the basics. The uniform stayed in the closet. The silence moved in. That was the legal part. It was clean, procedural, predictable. But the punishment that mattered didn't come from a court. It came from a choice. Reed was asked more than once what he wanted to happen to her. Reporters phrased it differently each time, hoping for a sharper answer. Accountability, justice, consequences. He never raised his voice, never leaned into the moment. He asked for the process to finish. He asked for reforms to be enforced. He declined to push for anything extra. No public condemnation, no demand to strip everything away. He didn't save her. He simply didn't destroy her. To some people, that felt wrong, incomplete, like mercy where punishment should have landed harder. But that restraint carried its own weight, because when someone is crushed completely, they can tell themselves a story, that they were targeted, that they were unlucky, that the system turned on them the way it turns on everyone eventually. Total destruction gives the guilty a place to hide. Reed gave her none. He left her just enough memory, enough time, enough space to understand exactly what she'd done, without the comfort of martyrdom or the excuse of cruelty. Monroe tried to rebuild in small ways. She applied for security work, consulting, anything that still sounded close to authority. Doors didn't slam, they simply didn't open. People were polite, brief, non-committal. Her past followed her without making noise. She started waking up early the way she always had. Habit didn't know the badge was gone. She'd sit at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in her hands, staring at nothing in particular. The nights were worse. That was when the footage played back without permission. Not the viral clips, the raw angles. The moments before the escalation, where she could see the decision forming and still feel the certainty that had fueled it. There was no courtroom left to argue in, no audience to perform for, just memory. Reed never contacted her again, never issued a statement, never claimed the moral high ground. That was the point. His forgiveness wasn't a gesture, it was a boundary. He refused to let her become the center of the story, refused to let her suffering redeem the harm she caused, refused to let vengeance write the ending. And that, quietly, was devastating. Because when punishment is loud, it ends. It burns through outrage and leaves behind a strange kind of relief. This didn't end. It settled. Monroe became someone people used to know, someone they spoke about in the past tense, someone whose name didn't spark debate anymore. That absence was its own sentence. The system moved forward without her. New policies rolled out, training manuals were rewritten, supervisors signed off on changes she would never enforce. Reed continued his work, different cities, different rooms, the same calm insistence on documentation, oversight, and interruption. He never framed what he did as forgiveness. He framed it as choice. Not every wrong needs to be met with equal force. Some need to be met with clarity so sharp it leaves no room to escape responsibility. Monroe had expected anger, hatred, retaliation. What she got was something colder. To live knowing the person she reduced to a threat had chosen not to erase her. To live knowing that choice wasn't kindness, it was control. And control, once lost, is never returned. That was the punishment without sound. No cheers, no fists raised. Just a life continuing, stripped of the illusion that power had ever made it right. And that understanding stayed. Every morning, every night. Long after the headlines moved on. After the hearings ended, the noise didn't fade all at once. It thinned. Monroe learned quickly that the world doesn't always punish loudly. Sometimes it just steps aside and lets you stand alone in what you've done. Without the uniform, she moved through the city differently. No one looked twice. No one stiffened when she passed. No one deferred. She waited in lines. She filled out forms. She explained gaps in her employment with careful, neutral words. Former colleagues didn't confront her. They didn't insult her. They didn't defend her either. They stopped calling. That silence wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like exile. It felt like erasure. In coffee shops, she'd hear fragments of conversation about police reform, about oversight, about how things were changing. No one said her name. No one needed to. The story had already moved on. That was the strange part. The world kept going without asking her permission. At home, time stretched. Days blurred together. The discipline that had once kept her sharp now turned inward, with nowhere useful to go. She cleaned, organized, rearranged the same drawers twice. Some nights she pulled the uniform from the closet and held it, not like armor, but like proof that the life had been real. It didn't comfort her. Memory filled the quiet instead. Not the shouting, not the headlines. The moments before. The certainty she'd felt, the ease of it. How natural it had seemed to assume control instead of question it. Those were the memories that stayed. Across the country, Reed continued his work. Different cities, different departments. The same rooms with the same fluorescent lights and the same tired excuses. He sat at long tables with binders stacked neatly in front of him, listening more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was about structure, about interruption, about what happens when nobody slows a moment down. He never mentioned Monroe. Not in interviews, not in reports. Not in offhand remarks meant to satisfy curiosity. To him, she was no longer relevant to the work. That wasn't indifference. It was focus. Reform doesn't need villains to linger. It needs systems to change. In one city, a supervisor rewrote escalation guidelines. In another, dispatch protocols were altered to allow immediate override. Small changes, unremarkable on their own. Together, they began to matter. Reed believed in that kind of progress. Quiet, documented, boring enough to last. For Monroe, that quiet progress was harder to face than anger would have been. Anger suggests connection, conflict, a shared space where something can still be argued. Silence offers nothing back. Weeks turned into months. Her name became something she had to explain rather than something that explained her. She learned how people pause when they recognize you, but don't want to reopen the story. They weren't cruel. They were done. That was when the weight settled in. Some failures can be corrected, appealed, reviewed. Others can't. They become part of you. Monroe began to understand that no apology could rearrange the sequence of that night. No explanation could unmake the choice once it had been made. There would always be a version of her that had stood there and acted without restraint. And there would always be the version of the man she'd reduced to a threat, calm, steady, unwilling to give her the absolution of destruction. That contrast stayed sharp. Reed never asked for her remorse, never acknowledged her attempts to rebuild, never granted her the relief of confrontation. In his world, the work mattered more than the wound. That was the final lesson. Justice doesn't always end with balance. Sometimes it ends with memory, with living long enough to know exactly where you crossed a line, and having no one left to argue that you didn't. Monroe carried that knowledge into ordinary days, into quiet evenings, into mornings that felt longer than they should have. No badge to blame, no authority to lean on. Just a past that didn't fade, even when everyone else stopped looking. Reed moved forward. The system adjusted. New safeguards took hold. The city forgot her name. And that forgetting, unannounced, unceremonious, became the longest sentence of all. Because some losses don't come with an ending. They come with a life that has to be lived afterward, one memory at a time. It's tempting to believe that systems fall only when they're attacked head-on. that corruption needs a riot, that injustice only collapses under pressure, that power gives way when it's forced to. But that's not what happened here. This system didn't break because someone fought it. It broke because, for a brief moment, the truth had nowhere left to hide. One calm person, one clear record, one decision not to escalate, not to run, not to blur the facts. That was enough. Marcus Reed didn't raise his voice that night. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't demand special treatment. He stood still. He followed instructions. He let the camera see what it needed to see. And that quiet discipline did more damage to a broken system than any act of defiance ever could. Because power built on assumption can survive anger, it can survive protests, it can even survive exposure, if that exposure is chaotic enough to dismiss. What it can't survive is clarity. A single moment where the story stays intact, where no one can rewrite it, where no one can explain it away. That's when systems start to panic, not because they're evil, but because they're fragile. They depend on confusion, on speed, on people reacting instead of recording. This story isn't telling you that everyone will be protected, that justice always arrives on time, or that the truth always wins. It's saying something more uncomfortable, that the difference between silence and change is often one choice, one decision to slow down, one refusal to play the role you're expected to play. Reed didn't win because he was powerful. He won because he didn't give the system what it needed to bury him. And Monroe didn't fall because she was uniquely cruel. She fell because, for once, the machinery kept running long enough to expose itself. That's the part worth remembering. Systems don't collapse when they're attacked. They collapse when they're forced to see themselves clearly. When the narrative doesn't splinter, when the evidence doesn't blink, when the moment doesn't pass unnoticed. You don't need a crowd standing beside you for that. You don't need permission. You don't even need certainty that it will work. Sometimes all you need is the courage to remain steady while everything around you expects chaos. If this story stayed with you, it's probably not because of the uniforms or the hearings or the fallout. It's because somewhere in it, you recognized a moment you've lived yourself, a moment where staying calm felt harder than reacting, where telling the truth felt riskier than letting it slide, where silence would have been easier, but heavier. If you know someone who's been there, this story might matter to them too. Not as outrage, not as spectacle, but as a reminder that truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be seen once, clearly enough that it can't be taken back.